In this episode, I get corrected by Vance Blackfox for not listening close enough. We also learn about the history of the TwoSpirit movement and what it's like to grow up Cherokee, Lutheran, and TwoSpirit. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about things we're not supposed to, learn how to have difficult conversations, and talk to people about what makes them different. This is the We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land podcast, where we do talk about that with me, Lucas Land.
It's never the right place or time. It's imperceptible to the eye. It's never the right place or time.
My guest today is Vance Blackfox. And Vance has an incredible bio that I'm excited to read. It's very, very long, but I'm really excited to read all of it because it's so many good things. Vance is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. He's an alumnus of Texas Lutheran University, as am I, and the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. Vance has served the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America in a variety of ways throughout his life, from taking a post as national president of the Lutheran Youth Organization to later working for the women of the ELCA, Augsburg Fortress Publishers, California Lutheran University, ELCA Youth Gathering, and LSTC's Youth in Mission. At present, he is the Indigenous Theologian and coordinating team member for the ELCA's Theological Roundtable. Building on this foundation, he has also created Otherwise, a cultural immersion experience for youth across the country. In addition to his extensive work with the ELCA, Vance is a devoted advocate for Native causes. He has held executive director positions at the Haskell Foundation and Oaks Indian Mission, and he currently works as the communications director for Native Americans in Philanthropy. He was recently elected president of the board of directors for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, and he has been appointed guest curator at the University of Texas at San Antonio Institute of Texan Cultures. He is also, as if we needed to add any more to this incredible bio that you sent me, the Indigenous Theologian for the Faith-Based Initiative for the City of San Antonio, where he currently resides. Welcome back to the promised land of Texas, Vance. And after all that, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks. I didn't expect you to read it all.
Well, I know, but as I said, it's such a great bio, and there's so many good things in it that I thought, man, this is great. I want to read it all. I want to sort of set the stage a little bit for the podcast when I have guests on, because I'm hoping to create a little bit of a different environment maybe than other interviews or podcasts. So up front, I want to say on this podcast, it's okay to disagree. Conflict is part of life, and that's the part of the idea of the podcast.
Are you sure? I don't know if that's a good idea.
Well, yeah, no, I think I'm sure. I'm going to find out, I think, as I do the podcast, how sure I really am about that.
We'll agree to disagree then.
There you go. Already, you're already starting off on the right foot.
Thanks.
Another thing is that it's okay to be wrong or make mistakes. This is a safe space. You don't have to worry about that. I want to ask questions, to be curious.
Well, good. I'm glad.
Vance, I want you to tell us a little bit about all those amazing things we read about you and things that you're doing. Very cool, very exciting. But I want to hear a little bit about growing up. And we've known each other for a long time, and I'm not sure I have heard about what was life like growing up for Vance.
Wow, I'm not so sure that I've told that story in a long time myself. I know that when I was a young person serving in the church, that oftentimes was my go-to story to tell, because my story seemed to be so different than everybody else around me. Serving in the Lutheran Church, which we know is the whitest church in the United States, and my being the Native youth leader, or one of the Native youth leaders in the church for some time at the time, there was a need for people to hear that story and about where I came from, versus maybe a lot of the privilege that those around me came from. So I grew up in a very tiny town, 500 people, where probably all of them were related to me in northeast Oklahoma, in the what we'd like to say is the heart of the Cherokee Nation. This little town called Oaks, Oklahoma, or Oaks, America, as folks like to call it there in that space. Was one that was a little difficult to be in. As a child, I guess a small child, it wasn't so difficult. In fact, it was quite easy, but it became more difficult a little later. But I guess I could share about my being a small child. I was the oldest grandchild on three sides of my family, and which made a big difference in how I was treated in many ways. I was very spoiled, quite frankly, not with material things at all, because we didn't have much material to be sharing with one another, but I was spoiled with attention. My mother and her mother and all my aunties and uncles were very attentive to Vance and his needs, which is really kind of fun looking back at it. My mother tells stories of how, I'd be playing in the yard. We lived with my grandmother for some time, and I'd be playing in the yard, and my aunties would drive by and, say, "Come with us, we're going to the store." And so I would just jump in the car, and they'd yell, to the house. And my mom would come to the door, "We're going to go to the store, we're taking him with us," and that happened often. My cousins and aunties lived up and down the street that we lived on, and so I was oftentimes in many of their homes, and probably fed more meals than I needed, just to be in those spaces and places in those homes with people who loved me. As I grew older, part of my journey as the oldest was also to be with culturally to be with my granny a lot, and my other grandparents. But my granny in particular, my mother's mother, was someone who I sought out and whose attention I valued a great deal. And so I spent a lot of time, even after we moved away from her home, with her in her home. And so that was really, really fantastic. Breakfast on the couch on Saturday mornings when, large heaping plates of biscuits and gravy and bacon, or, big old bowls of Cheerios. Man. Yeah, big old bowls.
You're making me miss home a little bit there.
I know. I miss it. The big old bowls of Cheerios with, lots of sugar. But also just lots of good attention and quite frankly praise. As I grew older, the turning points in my life and probably my whole family's life, including my little brother, who's about 6 years younger than I, was when my grandmother died. My granny died. She died from cancer, and at about the same time, my father was diagnosed with colon cancer. And while he lived with cancer, he certainly lived with it. He lived with cancer for the next 15 years.
Wow. Yeah.
And so at the same time, my best friend, who was also my cousin, more like my brother, Kevin, he committed suicide. So in all these, in this particular moment, this moment where I needed to find some care, some attention, some safety in many regards, in many ways, I not knowing where I was going to find it, it kind of just fell into my lap. I come from a historical Cherokee community that started over 200 years ago before the Trail of Tears, when the Moravian missionaries were asked to come in and educate the young leaders of the Cherokee Nation at the time. That ministry crossed the Trail of Tears. The Moravians did. They handed it over to the Lutherans. The Lutherans continued the ministry. And by Lutherans, I mean the natives who were Lutheran, though there were some Lutheran pastors that were sent and other, quote, missionaries from the Danish parts of Nebraska.
Okay, Vance, slow down a little bit. I think for most people, I can identify with biscuits and gravy and bacon and Cheerios with a lot of sugar. But what you're talking about growing up with Lutheran pastors who are Native American, I think, can you kind of talk about, can you kind of give me a picture of life growing up in a Lutheran church, but with Native American pastors?
Well, I didn't say that. I think you misheard. I wish we had.
See, this is where you get to correct my mistakes, because we're that kind of podcast.
I could only dream that we could have Lutheran pastors that are Lutheran. We do have a handful today, but my community, it seemed to be prevalent that all the pastors that came through there and continue to come through there are white, which is unfortunate. We've had a couple, one returning, who was Cherokee, who came back home to be pastor for some time, which is nice. But it was after I was an adult. Growing up, it was, white pastor hero syndrome type of stuff going on in the community, which he did good for the community, but it would have been nice to have Native leadership in our congregations, or in that congregations. But it was. And so.
But Nate, you did grow up both Lutheran and Native American.
Correct.
Okay.
I did. And so that story, the 200 years ago, the Moravian missionaries who handed off the ministry to the Lutherans, that's my family's story. And that's a book in itself. That's a movie in itself. That's many, many podcasts in itself. But for me is only a part of what it meant for me to grow up in this small town. And it also kind of formed how I understood myself, sort of this understanding of grace. I mean, I was lucky to understand grace because of my pastor having taught me such at an early age, and having what I thought maybe was a progressive or liberal ideology around theology. I question that now, but I look back. But it was probably more liberal and progressive, and it certainly was more liberal and progressive than like all the churches that surrounded our little town, which are mostly Southern Baptist or Methodist, more conservative Methodist, Catholic, etc. So anyway, so around this time, all this was happening, not knowing, all the death that was happening, and my father being ill. It just so happened that two things pretty significant what came down. One, I was introduced to the Lutheran Youth Organization, an organization that was a national organization in the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And I became a leader on a local level, a synodical level. By synod, for us, our synod would have been a local terminology, so Arkansas, Oklahoma. And I began to understand myself as a two-spirit person. Even in my community and much of the world at the time, because that was quite a time, 30 years ago, people would not have really understood what two-spirit was. And in fact, today still don't know what two-spirit is. But it's the third gender in the Native traditions, Native culture. Some people, would say that gay, a lot of people who are two-spirit oftentimes just say they're gay to make it simple. There are some gay people who are two-spirit as well. Again, another podcast, another book, another movie. But so I was beginning to understand myself more fully, even as a very early teen, while at the same time becoming this leader in the church. I did not come out to anyone, though I had been teased for some time about my being a little more effeminate. My voice was pretty high, just coincidentally, until I was probably 16, 17 years old. I was teased and harassed and bullied and around issues of sexuality and gender by people in the community, or mostly boys my age, some girls. It was a small town. And while I put on a brave face and a good front, I think it was tough. And so a lot of my survival depended upon escapism. And I worked very hard to be the overachiever, so I could continue to get, great praise and attention from my aunties, uncles, mom, dad, whoever, but also so I could be permitted and given permission to also do the other things that I wanted to do, which was continue to work inside the Lutheran Youth Organization, which took me to other places in the world. So, I became a national leader at the age of 14 years old and was all over the place, all over the United States and in some other countries. So I was always able to look forward to the next opportunity to escape my little town and go out into the world and see something different and be with people who were a little kinder to me and loved me. Now, that is not to say that everybody in my town was mean to me or bullied me. My family loved me. They loved me a great deal and cared for me and stood up for me. My cousins were my lifesavers back home, and I'll be forever indebted to them for that.
Yeah.
And so during those 6 years of junior high and high school, escapism was an art form for me, and I'm very happy to have the experience of the Lutheran Youth Organization and all the amazing friends, and quite frankly, adopted family that I gained by having that experience in the church on the national level. From my high school, as valedictorian of my high school class, and 3 days after I graduated high school, I moved away from my little town and sought freedom permanently in a place called San Antonio, which is where I reside once again after having moved away a couple of times.
Yeah, welcome home.
Thanks. It's good to be home.
Hey, I want to ask you a question, ask you to maybe explain a little bit more. I knew I was going to be talking to you today, and I was on Facebook, and I came across this article on Indian Country Today, and the headline was Two Spirits, One Heart, Five Genders. And it kind of was going through a bit of the history, pre-settler history of Native identities and gender understandings. And I was kind of blown away, like, oh man, I'm going to talk to Vance today, and here's this article. And I was really struck by this one quote from that article that I'll put in the show notes for the podcast, by George Catlin, who was one of the settlers, who said that the two-spirit tradition among Native Americans must be extinguished before it can be more fully recorded. And I was just kind of really, just kind of shocked by that statement. Not that I was surprised, but still the force of it, like needing to extinguish it so that it was just not remembered or recorded or known at all. Thankfully for yourself and many others, that tradition wasn't destroyed, wasn't extinguished. And I know that it can be an entire podcast that we could do, and there's probably lots of great maybe resources if you have one you could recommend. But could you mentioned about that people, Native Americans who see themselves in that tradition of two-spirit and different genders that Native traditions have had, sometimes use gay as a shorthand or other ways of referring to themselves in order to not have to explain all of that. So would you explain some of it, maybe? I know you can't fully give it its due in a few minutes, but could you give us a little bit more, a deeper understanding about what two-spirit means to you and your understanding from your tradition?
Sure. So a lot of ways to go about giving this explanation. A lot of two-spirit people have a variety of ways of understanding it for themselves. So I have to say that first and foremost, mostly because everyone comes to the circle as a two-spirit person, a third gender person, differently because of how, or what our tradition might have been. Some are more intact and connected, like a lot of our cultural identity is for different tribes for different reasons, depending upon how colonization impacted different tribes throughout Turtle Island. But I will say that, simply put, the understanding of two-spirit comes from our understanding of there being multiple gender identities in our communities. Again, every community is a little different, so not everyone is the same. But some would have identified 3, some would identify 4, some would have identified 5. So you'd have male and female, or man and woman, and then third gender male-bodied or third gender female-bodied. Or the third gender person would have been in many cases understood as being extra special. They would have been honored and revered in many regards. A lot of folks like to use that word about two-spirit people back and their understanding of how they were treated back in the day. They were considered blessed by the Creator, extra blessed, because they were able to see the world from two perspectives, both male and female. And so many Two-Spirit people were the holy people, the medicine keepers, the story keepers, the caregivers or teachers of children, and a variety of other roles. They would have been considered special. It would not have been in some tribes normal for a man to marry a Two-Spirit person, or a Two-Spirit person to marry a man if that was a male-bodied Two-Spirit, or even for women, woman marrying a male-bodied Two-Spirit person. But for some tribal groups, that would not have been strange. In fact, it's recorded that it was important for some chiefs to have a Two-Spirit wife. So that's those, and again, that's just a lot of stories condensed into just really quick statements coming out of my mouth. So a lot of folks would disagree and or not relate to some of those things because their tribes were different. And I'm looking at it from a macro point of view.
I'll definitely include the article so people can follow up with some better information, because it has some details and maybe can help people go a little more in depth. But I think it is helpful to learn about. I think a lot of times we think that these issues about sexuality and gender are something new, and we're wrestling with them in the modern era. That's something new that's happening that we've had to kind of wrestle with. And to learn about traditions, pre-European setting foot on the soil of North America, this was a real, not an issue. I don't mean to call it an issue, but it existed. It was people's reality, and it wasn't something that got invented when Queer Eye for the Straight Guy came on TV, or Will and Grace or something, and now somehow the Hollywood liberal media invented it. It's helpful to go back and say, no, there's a longer history to think about and try to understand. So yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that, and thanks for giving us a little bit more depth. Yeah.
Problem. And what troubles it all is the fact that English language also doesn't even give justice to what we're trying to say. Right? We're a new creation.
Yeah.
Two-Spirit means, in my opinion, implies that it's two different things. When in some cases we would argue that Two-Spirit is a whole new creation. But with that said, and maybe if I give a little context, I have had the privilege of meeting some of the folks who began this Two-Spirit movement, or the reclamation of the understanding of third gender, and then of course the terminology of Two-Spirit coming out of that. It came about back in the 70s and 80s when the AIDS epidemic was beginning to really get going, and Native people who live in urban communities who had been outcast from their tribal situations, their reservations, and other communities because of the Christian influence on the tribal reservations and communities. They felt like gay people felt like they had to leave, and so they were planted inside of these urban communities, and then AIDS really was coming after them as well, and they had so few resources. And social workers and caregivers and others began having conversations with Native people in those situations as they began and continued to take care of folks who were in those communities and potentially dying. And began having conversations with elders. Well, what was that for us? And so the elders began talking about how we have always had this third gender. They always had this third and fourth gender, and it wasn't anything new. It was ancient, and began talking about who they were for us, as who Two-Spirit people have been for us. And then later on, the terminology Two-Spirit came about probably around the same time. It was officially adopted by a large gathering of Two-Spirit people in 1990. So that's supposedly this official date that people are using. But Two-Spirit was first used to understand people understand themselves as LGBTQ as they are connected to their tribe. And then I think at the same time there was this morph, and if you will, at least from what I've been taught and how I understand myself, that Two-Spirit was about how third gender people were connected to the circle, connected to the tribe, connected to their traditional place, and traditional or at least traditional understanding of themselves and what they could be or should be. And there is a difference between Two-Spirit for some of us and LGBTQ natives, but there's also, I think, a combination of both. So I think there can be LGBTQ natives who are Two-Spirit, and there can be LGBTQ natives who don't identify as Two-Spirit. And all of those things are great and wonderful, and we have to celebrate each other.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things that I have appreciated, and what I feel like very little I know about the Two-Spirit tradition, and that relates really well to the idea of this podcast and trying to understand our differences, is that in those traditions, the reason that Two-Spirit people are so highly valued, is because they embody more than one perspective, right? They're able to, they were people who had the ability to see things the way that others were not able to see. And I find that really, really helpful. And as I've come to know, people in the LGBT community, that has been the gift and the blessing to me in learning about people's experiences and their understandings of themselves and what it means to be trans or queer in any way, is that they have insights that I really need.
I would agree with you that, it's important to recognize that LGBTQ people certainly have gifts to offer in regard to their coming from a different perspective. But let's be very clear. I think it's important for us to be clear on a couple of things. One, that while they may have these gifts that I've listed off that Two-Spirit people have, we won't know if that is ancient, like it is for Native people who are Spirit. The LGBTQ people certainly have some wisdom about themselves because of the struggle that we have had to go through in society, right? Their journey just to understand themselves gives them innately some wisdom that, is valuable and that we all should be learning from. But we know ourselves as Two-Spirit people to have always had this ancient wisdom. So I don't want us to confuse two things. One, that the wisdom that LGBTQ people possess is the same wisdom that Two-Spirit people have. The other thing I don't want anybody to confuse, LGBTQ people who are not Native are not Two-Spirit. One of the things, one of the few things that can't be appropriated. They just can't be appropriated because this has always been a part of our culture. But if it was a part of anybody else's culture, we don't know. And so I don't want to confuse the two wisdoms.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for clarifying that. And yeah, just to be totally honest, I'm a straight, white, cis, male, married, kids. I'm like embody all of the stereotypes and patriarchal norms in the world. And so I have had to learn from, people like yourself and people that I know. So I appreciate you clarifying and giving kind of more depth to that.
Sure.
One thing that from my experience, learning about different groups and different people, is that whenever you have a box to put them in, any group, as soon as you scratch the surface, you realize, oh, it's more complicated and there's a lot more going on and there's a lot more learning to be done. There's never this sort of monolithic. We like to tell those stories, right? Have those narratives that say, even the LGBTQ movement, right? But then if you start talking to people who have been through those years and through Stonewall and all of those years of activism, you find out, oh, it's complicated. They didn't always get along, and there was racism, and there was so many other things going on. That it's important to talk about those things, and really that's part of why I wanted to start this podcast, is to say we need to talk about those things, and not try to just make it an easy narrative to have, right? Let's just have this easy narrative that kind of, for the LGBTQ movement, I'm sure sometimes tried to cover over Two-Spirit or appropriate Two-Spirit, as you're saying. as a way to further the movement, right? Because they saw it as a good thing. And maybe one thing we can take away is sometimes it feels like it's a good thing to do that to further the cause, but we always have to be willing to listen when people say that's hurting me, or that doesn't represent me fully, or something along those lines. I don't know. What would you say to that?
I would say you're right. You're right on, and quite frankly, the stories that have been told to me by those elders who were part of this Two-Spirit reclamation back in the 70s and 80s, they were telling me stories about how they were not welcomed. I mean, in gay community, they just weren't. I mean, they were present maybe in the bars and the community centers or wherever people were gathering, but gay people, especially gay white men in particular, were not welcoming of Native people who were gay. And let's be real frank, a lot of people will say that gay is white, and for a variety of reasons, and a lot of it has to do with privilege. And so even today, the example that I might use, we had World Pride in New York City just a couple of weeks ago, 50 years after Stonewall, and Two-Spirit people had gathered in that space and were not even given a place to really be honored or welcomed in ways in which a lot of organizations these days are welcoming Native people to acknowledge kind of the atrocities and or acknowledge the land, right, that people are gathered on at that moment. But they're there being present and being in solidarity with everyone else from a Native perspective, from a Two-Spirit perspective, and then you have people still showing up, quote, dressed like Indians for Pride, wearing headdresses and loincloths, and being overly sexualize themselves with our, quote, type of clothing. We are still dealing with the same thing a lot of other Native people, non-Two-Spirit people, are experiencing out in the world. A progressive movement like the LGBTQ movement over the last decades still cannot come to grips with the fact that there are people who are different than they are, and that needs to be respected. Coincidentally, I was just watching the remake or the new reboot series Tales of the City, which was in its old form back in the 90s or 80s. I don't remember when it came on the first time. It was pretty racy. It was out there talking about LGBT issues, etc. And this reboot, I just saw an episode just moments ago of kind of the disconnects and why the disconnects are happening between generations, between gay older men and gay younger men, between black young men and older white men, and conversations around gender, language, and what we call people. All those conversations just continue to have to happen, and we need to do that in a way that is respectful and good and helpful, and embrace everyone. There's just some people who just can't do that very well.
I've never heard of Tales of the City before, so I'm gonna have to check it out, both the old and the new version.
Yeah, I would encourage you to watch the old version and then watch the new one. It's important to do because it gives you the continuation. The reboot's the continuation of some of their stories.
Well, I mean, as you said, we could keep talking for a long time about this topic, and it's an important one, and maybe hopefully one we can come back to on another episode. But I wanted to maybe switch gears a little bit. When you were growing up, what did you learn? What were the messages that you got or examples that were shown to you about how to handle conflict?
I'm still learning today, and maybe I'm
yeah, same here.
I mean, I've since learned that my being Two-Spirit is one of the reasons why, people didn't agree with my last visit home. My last visit home, I was the executive director of my family's ministry, and there was a lot of other reasons why people thought I shouldn't be there, at least given publicly, none of which I agree with, of course. Come to find out, there was a lot of messaging and tossing around of my not being healthy for the community because I was Two-Spirit, when in fact I'd worked very hard with a good team to put together a healthy system for the ministry that was there. All that to say, I'm still dealing with conflict in my own community in some regard. I'm still healing from that time there. But as a young person, dealing with conflict there was just like there was always just a lot of conflict. The conflict that I experienced personally really wasn't around bullying, people making fun of me, people teasing me, people being mean to me, for different reasons. At home, there was certainly conflict, just like any family has conflict. We weren't a perfect family, but we were a hard-working family. I guess some example I could use is my parents worked very hard. We lived in low-income housing that was provided for us by Housing and Urban Development through the Cherokee Nation's relationship with HUD. Of course, we had to pay for the home, but it was very low cost for people depending upon their income. My parents decided to go ahead and work very hard to quickly pay off the low mortgage, right? The amount that the house cost wasn't a great amount considering relative to most properties that size. And so some people paid a very low amount. My parents paid the greatest amount just to get their house paid off. They paid it off, and then the next year a grant was given to a lot of Native nations to pay off all the housing in Indian country.
Oh man.
So it was indirect conflict, and while it was very, there was no reward or even any refund given to my parents for having paid off the house, so quickly. And so, of course, there was some frustration and angst around that they worked so hard to do it. And, of course, the payoffs are incredibly great. My brother and I saw an example of my parents who worked very hard to pay off their bills, but also to take care of what we had. And the conflict and the resolve around conflict always seemed to be one of grace. The immediate probably reaction and frustration is probably what I witnessed. I'd be frustrated too, probably. One of, it is what it is. We'll value what we have. There's nothing we can do about it. And we'll just be happy that everybody else was able to have their homes paid off for them. So I got to witness some grace in that regard. After my father's death, somehow through my father's illness, they had to mortgage the house in order to help pay bills and keep food on the table and pay for chemo and other hospital bills. Non-native bank put a lien or added my father's name to the title somehow. And my mother, after he died, could not, or even before he died, could not make any moves in regard to her own house, even though it was in her name. Conflict with the bank. And certainly, I'm sure she was frustrated, mad, angry, hurt. A man's name is the first name that gogoes on, even though it was her property. This is the 1990s, right? But it was just a matter of, okay, I can't do anything about it. How am I going to have grace about this? So those are larger, bigger ways of thinking about conflict. But most of the conflict, funny enough, as a child, really was the bullying and the fighting and people being mean. And the way in which I stepped through that was one, stepping to the bullies. How many times did I have to step and say, okay, if you want to fight, let's fight, right? Luckily, I didn't have to. A lot of the conflict that I experienced sometimes with people, especially adults, who would say inappropriate things about race and or sexuality. And so I learned at a very early age that the right thing to do is to say something. I don't quite know where I got that other than my sense of call to justice for people who are different than me, or even like me.
That's not what everybody would learn or how everybody would respond.
No.
I mean, there's probably lots of people whose response to bullying or being called names or racist or whatever slurs would respond with avoidance or humor, right? There's so many different ways that people try to handle that kind of thing growing up or in their life. But your response was to step into it and deal with it, to take it head on.
Yeah. A lot of what we're taught, and as Indian kids, is be respectful to everybody. But I just could not understand why it would be important. Why the people who were being disrespectful to me or people who I cared about, why they deserved respect, and how my calling an injustice out is disrespectful. And a lot of times that's what happens, right? There's a power play. Oh, well, they're being disrespectful to this teacher or to this leader in the community because they're calling them out on their injustice or their misbehavior, right? and a lot of it has to do with age and power. And I've just never understood that. If the fact the person who was causing pain and or the injustice or the harm should not be allowed to do that. And I didn't feel like I was ever being disrespectful, and instead that I was stepping into place where I could offer some of my power and some of my healing when other people that could do that for themselves. It happened throughout my teenagers. I've had to practice that a great deal in the church, both on the congregational level there, but also on the national level. How many times have I run into racism over and over and over myself, and always think, man, and then I step into it, I lean into it, and I call it out for what it is without letting it pass, right? And then I immediately think, oh my gosh, I have the wherewithal by which to combat this injustice and this racism, verbally and otherwise. What about all those people who these, hateful people, these racists are treating other people in the church, and those folks don't have the same capacity or the desire or power to do that.
It seems in recent the last couple of years, there's a lot of talk about civility, that we need to have a discourse that's somehow civil. And part of the problem with that way of talking about it is exactly what you're talking about, saying somebody's being disrespectful, finding a way to sort of dismiss somebody that's upset about something, saying they're not talking about it the right way, or any number of things, is a way to avoid having a difficult conversation, or having to actually think about, is what I did or said racist, and I need to think about that. Instead, it's a lot easier to say, oh, you were being disrespectful, or we need to have civility. And part of what I'm hoping we can do with this podcast is talk about things that are difficult and not be civil. I mean, be respectful to each other, I suppose, but be willing to talk about things that are uncomfortable or difficult to talk about, And I've already, just in this conversation with you, had the chance to learn a couple of new things and be corrected, right? And that's what it's about. The civility discourse is a way to say, well, we really don't want to have the hard conversation. That's at least in my mind, that's what I hear when I hear people saying, don't talk about that, you're being disrespectful, or you need to be more civil. It's a way to avoid a hard conversation.
Yeah, and sometimes just being quiet, right? And it is the only way in which you can be civil in a room where you have the least amount of power, unfortunately. And that's a really hard judgment to make. When do I deflect this? Do I protect myself, or do I just listen? And even though what's coming at you might be uncivil, or inappropriate, or strategized, or what have you. And that's a tough one. I learned a lot from my mother, and I've learned a lot from both of my brothers, Pastor Manuel and my brother Jeffrey, and about grace and being civil from all three of them always exhibiting such kindness and understanding how to do that. Here in San Antonio, we're a compassionate city, one of the leading compassionate cities in the world. And I don't mean that like in general. Not everybody here in San Antonio is compassionate, but
I've driven in San Antonio, and I'm pretty sure there's some not compassionate drivers for sure.
We are working on becoming a more compassionate city. Modeling that for other cities is important to us, and part of that is related to the faith-based initiative that you read in my bio, and Reverend Ann Helmke, who has been a leader here in the city of San Antonio around peacemaking and justice seeking and a variety of things, is leading that faith-based initiative and compassionate charge for us, and we're all grateful for that. I get to be a part of that conversation, and was utilized on a panel of other city leaders on how to have a conversation modeling civility. And it was just really fantastic to see so many people who, from different places in the community, who deal with a variety of audiences who aren't always civil to them, getting to model that for a larger group of people. And so that was really great. And I always want to be able to model that for folks. And sometimes being direct can be perceived as being not civil, or uncivil. And that's maybe where I need to practice a little more civility myself. I can be sometimes very blunt and direct, though I don't do it with any added emotion. It's just communication. Nonetheless, people receive it differently. And understanding how people are receiving your communication is also part of the practice of civility. So yes, being able to have a conversation where we learn from one another is important, and having conversations where we are learning how to communicate better are I think, great opportunities for growing ourselves.
I remember when I was in seminary, I took a class where part of our class was to go to the Christian Community Development Association conference. Mm-hmm. And I think it was in St. Louis the year that I went. I heard John Perkins speak, and one of the things he said will always stick with me. He's an African-American writer, theologian, activist, one of the founders of the Christian Community Development Association. And one of the things he said was that reconciliation between African Americans and white people was not about sitting down to have a cup of coffee, but it was about having enough of a relationship to have the conversations that were really difficult when you wanted to call out something someone did that was upsetting to you, and to be willing to have those harder conversations, not to just be friends on kind of a surface level, but to have the conversations about things that mattered. The things that were much, much deeper. And it sounds like, yeah, that's the idea. I love the idea of a compassionate city, even, considering the drivers maybe at San Antonio, or all the people who aren't compassionate yet, or who are maybe needing some extra work. Yeah, they're learning.
People who are needing to learn how to be more compassionate to our homeless population, et cetera, et cetera. So we're working on it. We're doing.
Yeah. But it's that idea of being able to listen to people who come from a different context or have a different perspective on something. As John Perkins was saying, somebody might call something you do racist. And how are you going to be able to hear that for me as a white male, to hear things that I've had called out as sexist or racist? How am I going to respond when that happens? Am I going to be able to listen, or do I tense up and say, nope, that's not me. That's that person's problem, or am I open to thinking about it and trying to really listen to other people and understand where they're coming from? That has always opened my world to be much bigger. And boy, my world needs opening. My world needs a lot more to it than my little narrow rural Texas upbringing that I had, and that's how we have to do it, right? Is being open to listening without shutting off as soon as we're called out on something.
And I appreciate that. I'm sure that there have been moments where that would be real easy for you to do, right? But as long as I've known you, at least as long as the times that I've gotten to engage with you, in our younger life in particular, you've always been so kind and humble and one that has opened ears and open hearts. So I just always appreciated that about you. And I think that this podcast and these conversations you'll be having are indicative of that. So thank you, Lucas.
Oh, thanks, Vance. I didn't expect you to, say nice things about me on my own podcast. It's about, time for us to maybe start wrapping up. So I want to leave people every episode with maybe some insights or things that we've learned, and then some things that we could do as we're trying to learn how to have these kind of conversations in our world. So you can be thinking about something maybe out of our conversation tonight that you take away, and then something that you would recommend for people that they could do. And then I'll go first while you're thinking. I appreciate a lot getting the chance to have conversations with people like you that are different than me in many ways, although we do have a lot of things in common, and being willing to talk about things that, to be honest, I still have a lot to learn about. And in front of however many people decide to listen to this podcast to say, oh, okay, I'll be quiet while Vance explains TwoSpirit to me. So the thing that I really take away from that conversation, there's always more to learn. And as soon as you think you really have it all wrapped up in a bow and you understand everything there is to know about something, be ready for someone to teach you something that you didn't know, because it seems like there's always more depth, more complexity, sometimes more to it than we like to think. If you're coming at an issue or group of people or anything with a neat narrative that gives you good guys and bad guys, dig a little deeper and you're bound to find a lot more to learn and a lot more stuff beneath the surface. The action step or thing that we could do that I'll recommend is to ask good questions. And as an extrovert and somebody who tends to talk a lot, to recommend to my extrovert brothers and sisters out there to find times to ask a question, maybe, and then be quiet and be okay with some silence while some people kind of get their thoughts together and share them with you. We miss a lot. I miss a lot because I'm constantly talking. I constantly have opinions, and I need to make sure I make space for people to share with me their perspectives and be ready to listen. So, Vance, what's something you learned and then something we could do?
Something I learned. Well, first of all, again, thank you for introducing this practice. I think it's a good one and one that I might steal from you. So thank you. Something that I learned would be that I have the capacity by which to be civil. I think I knew I could practice it, but that I'm owning it. Right? That's what I learned about myself, I guess, through this conversation, that I just need to own the fact that I understand civility and I need to employ it as often as possible. That's something that I learned about myself. In this conversation, what I learned in general maybe would have been that it's important for me to tell and share my stories, whether they be the personal ones from back in the day. Those have value still today, like they did maybe to those young people that I shared them with growing up out in the world. So I need to keep doing that, as well as sharing stories about what it means to be TwoSpirit, what it means to be a theologian, what it means to be an advocate of civility and justice, peace, equity, and truth and healing. Those are important things to continue to do from a Native perspective. So thank you for reminding me of that. And then something that we could do, I go around doing workshops a lot still, even to this day, and around Indian 101 or facilitating the blanket exercise for folks, which is also about Indigenous history, Native history, or talking about TwoSpirit issues. And I'm always just surprised by how little people know about in Native people in the United States. I'm sure I could say, I don't want to say the same thing about Canada and Mexico, but I'm sure it may be the same. But on Turtle Island, there's so little that people know about the Indigenous peoples of this land. And so I have a list of resources that I'd be willing to share with you, Lucas, that you can put up with.
Absolutely.
It's a starter list. Some may think, oh, that's pretty deep, but it really is a starter list. The one thing I also recognize is that because of my need to survive, my escapism, and when I went out into the world where so many people were different than me, I became pretty culturally competent pretty early and pretty young. And so that's one of the reasons why I do the work that I do, I think, is because I want other people to have some cultural competency about themselves. So all that to say, there are resources that will help people to begin their journey understanding Native people, but also begin appreciating the need to be culturally competent, or at least knowledgeable about Native people. So I think we can all use one of these resources or multiple resources and learn a little more.
Yeah, absolutely. As I've learned more about people that are different than me, one of the things I realize is it's my work to learn about people that are different. People who are different have been different their whole lives, and they didn't need me to tell them they were different. If I want to know more about it, then that's my work. you know.
Yeah.
I feel really lucky to have friends like you and many other friends who've been willing to teach me different things. But yeah, it's on all of us to learn about people who are different than us and take the time to do it. So yeah, we'll definitely include your list of resources in the show notes to go deeper and learn more about Native Americans, TwoSpirit. I'm sure I haven't seen your list of resources, but I'm sure it's fabulous. And so I'm looking forward to adding a lot of those things to my own list.
Great. And just one last thing, if I might, for your listeners, otherwise.red is my website for our organization that does cultural immersion work. And it really is, part of our mission is to help young people in particular, but not just young people, all people learn how to build relationships with people who are different than themselves. And that's the language we use as well. And so it's really awesome that I get to talk with you who have passion for doing the same. So thank you for doing this, Lucas. That's great.
Yeah, you beat me to it. That was my last question. I was going to ask how people can get a hold of you or find your work online or get in touch with you. So otherwise.red is your organization that's working on connecting people to that work. Any other places that people can find you online? Anything else you want to share before we go?
I would just say that the work that I do, I'm not in this interview. I'm not representing Native Americans in philanthropy, though that's my full-time job. But I would say that we have built some strength and some good growth around the truth and healing movement. You'll hear a lot of good work or a lot of work being connected to the truth and healing movement, and that's the truth of the genocide, the atrocities happened to Native people, and who was a part of that, the complicity, and still today, but also then the healing that needs to happen, and not just the healing of Native people, but the healing of all people. If we as Native people carry with us a generational trauma, then a lot of non-Native people, especially white people, carry with them generational hate. We all have some healing to do. And so there's some great resources also to be found at our Native American Philanthropy website, which I'll include on my list of resources. And so Truth and Healing Movement, join the Truth and Healing Movement, get involved, find out how you can be a part of that work, or at least support that work philanthropically or otherwise.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Vance, for being with us. I feel I'm a little tempted to start like part 2 and just go ahead and continue. Thanks so much for spending your time with us and sharing so much of yourself and your own story and wisdom with us. Thanks, Vance.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the podcast. I hope you found it helpful. If you enjoyed it, please help us spread the word by subscribing, sharing it with your friends, rating and reviewing it on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Many thanks to Neil Curran and Infielder for the use of their music. You can find more of their music online at infielder.bandcamp.com. We would love to hear from you and get your feedback on the show or future topic ideas. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at WDTAT Podcast, or email us at wdtatpodcast@gmail.com. A final thought from Brené Brown. The willingness to show up changes us. It makes us a little braver each time. Until next time, keep showing up and keep being brave.
What are you gonna do?